Between the cornfields and quiet rivers of the American Midwest, there are forgotten stories. Stories of enemies who plowed this land, of strangers who arrived as prisoners and left transformed. It was 1943. While American boys bled on European beaches and Pacific islands, something extraordinary was happening in the heart of Minnesota. Thousands of German and Italian soldiers, men who had fought against the United States, were living among American families, working the same fields, breathing the same air. Most people don't know this happened. Hundreds of prison camps scattered across the country, hidden in plain sight. In Minnesota alone, thousands of enemy prisoners of war worked alongside farmers whose sons were overseas fighting their countrymen. Dr. Robert Jensen, local historian, recalls the shock in community records. Newspapers from 1943 show the fear. Headlines screamed, "Enemy soldiers arrive in our county." Families locked their doors. Parents kept children inside. Yet something unexpected occurred in those fields under the Minnesota sun, something that would challenge everything these communities believed about war, about enemies, about humanity itself. The war had created a crisis. American farms were dying. With young men drafted overseas, crops rotted in fields. The harvest was failing. The nation needed workers desperately. The solution was radical. Use the enemy. German Afrika Korps soldiers captured in North Africa, Italian troops who had surrendered after Mussolini's fall. Young men, most barely 20 years old, transported across the Atlantic in cargo ships, uncertain of their fate. They arrived expecting camps like those in Europe. Barbed wire, brutality, starvation. Instead, they found something they couldn't comprehend. What happens when you treat your enemy with dignity, when you offer them humanity in the midst of hatred? This is the story of an experiment, one that would forever change both prisoners and captors, one that history almost forgot. The year 1943 marked a turning point in World War II. In North Africa, Field Marshal Rommel's legendary Afrika Korps had finally surrendered to Allied forces. Over 150,000 German soldiers became prisoners overnight. In Italy, the fascist regime collapsed, sending tens of thousands of Italian troops into captivity. Britain faced an impossible problem: where to put them all. The island nation, already stretched thin by years of war, couldn't house such massive numbers. Food was rationed. Space was scarce. The solution came from across the Atlantic. America would take them. Starting in 1943, Liberty ships began crossing the ocean carrying an unusual cargo. The enemy, German and Italian prisoners, packed into holds that once transported tanks and ammunition, now carried men who had tried to kill Allied soldiers weeks before. Franz Weber, a German corporal captured in Tunisia, later wrote, "We thought we were going to our deaths." Rumors spread through the ship. They would throw us into the sea, work us to death in mines, starve us in desert camps. We prayed in the darkness. The crossing took 2 weeks. Men who had fought in scorching North African deserts now shivered in the Atlantic cold. Some were defiant, still loyal to Hitler. Others were simply exhausted, grateful the war was over for them. When they reached American shores, trains carried them inland. Not to the coasts, where security was tight, but deep into the heartland: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Kansas, states most Americans associated with farmland and small towns, not prisoners of war. Over 500 camps were established across the United States. Minnesota alone would house thousands of German and Italian POWs in facilities scattered throughout the state: Algona, Faribault, New Ulm, Howard Lake. The trains arrived at small-town stations where curious crowds gathered. Farmers in overalls stood alongside housewives and elderly men, watching uniformed enemy soldiers step onto American soil. "I was 7 years old," recalls Margaret Anderson, now in her 80s. "My father took me to see them arrive. I asked him, 'Daddy, are these the bad men?' He didn't answer right away. He just watched them, these skinny boys carrying worn duffel bags, looking scared and lost." Local newspapers captured the tension. The Faribault Daily News, June 1943. "German prisoners arrive. Citizens urged to remain calm." The headlines reflected a nation caught between fear and practicality. These were the enemy, the same Germans who had torpedoed American ships, who had killed American boys in combat. the same Italians who had aligned with Hitler's madness. Yet they looked so ordinary. Many were teenagers, 17, 18, 19 years old, farm boys themselves, conscripted into armies they barely understood. They walked with slumped shoulders, uncertain steps. Their eyes darted nervously at the watching Americans. "We expected monsters," said Henry Mueller, a farmer who would later employ POW labor. "We got kids who looked like they needed a good meal and their mothers." The prisoners were sorted and assigned. Germans to certain camps, Italians to others, high-ranking officers separated from enlisted men, Nazi sympathizers identified and isolated. The UES Army followed the Geneva Convention strictly. These men would be treated humanely, fed adequately, housed properly. But questions lingered in every small town that received them. Could you trust the enemy? Could you let them walk your fields? Could you look into their eyes without seeing your son's killer? The prisoners had questions too, whispered in German and Italian in their barracks that first night. What would the Americans do to them? How long would they be here? Would they survive to see home again? Neither side knew that this arrangement, enemy and citizen working side by side, would create something unprecedented, something that would challenge the very nature of war itself. The experiment had begun. Spring 1943 brought a crisis to the American heartland. The fields of Minnesota stretched endlessly, rich soil ready for planting, but there was no one to work them. The draft had taken nearly every able-bodied young man. Fathers over 40 struggled to manage farms designed for crews of 5 or 6. Women and children worked dawn to dusk, but it wasn't enough. Crops from the previous season rotted in storage. New plantings faced the same fate. America was feeding not just itself, but Allied forces across 2 oceans. The farms of the Midwest were as strategic as any battlefield, yet they were failing. The War Manpower Commission made a controversial decision: deploy the POWs. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be used for non-military labor. They would be paid 80 cents per day, a symbolic amount, and their work would help keep America fed while their own countries starved under Allied blockades. For many farmers, the idea was repulsive. "You want me to work alongside the bastards who might have killed my son?" one farmer told a government agent. His boy had died at Anzio, cut down by German machine gun fire, but desperation overrode disgust. The alternative was bankruptcy and national food shortages. The first morning they arrived, Farmer Thomas Olson stood by his barn watching the army truck approach. His hands trembled slightly. He'd fought in the First World War, had killed Germans in the Argonne Forest. Now they were coming to his farm. The truck's back gate dropped. 12 German prisoners stepped out, blinking in the bright Minnesota sun. An army guard held a rifle, but loosely, without real menace. They were boys, Olson later told his daughter. Thin boys in faded uniforms. One couldn't have been more than 17. They looked at me with fear in their eyes, and I realized they were as scared of me as I was angry at them. The work began simply: planting sugar beets, harvesting corn, canning vegetables in local processing facilities. The prisoners worked in crews, always supervised, always counted at day's end. The Geneva Convention mandated their treatment: same food rations as American soldiers, adequate housing, access to medical care and leisure time. Camp inspectors arrived regularly to ensure compliance. The reality often exceeded requirements. Many prisoners couldn't believe what they received. 3 meals daily, with meat, clean barracks with real beds, medical attention when needed, access to books, musical instruments, sports equipment. Klaus Schneider, a former Wehrmacht soldier, wrote in his diary, "I eat better here than I did in the German army. We have coffee, bread with butter, sometimes pie. While our families in Germany starve, we eat like kings in the enemy's land." The work was hard but not cruel. Farm labor from dawn until late afternoon, with breaks for water and lunch. The Minnesota summer heat rivaled North Africa, but at least there were no bullets, no bombs, no death waiting around every corner. Something unexpected began to happen in those fields. The prisoners sang while they worked, German folk songs, Italian ballads. The melodies drifted across the corn rows, strange and beautiful. Farmers found themselves humming along to tunes in languages they didn't understand. Language barriers broke down through necessity and gesture. A German prisoner teaching a farmer the efficient way to bundle wheat, learned in his father's fields near Munich. An Italian showing a farm wife how to prune tomato plants for better yield. Small conversations emerged. Kinder, children, a German would ask, showing photos of his own family. The farmer would pull out his wallet, display his sons in uniform. Both men would nod, understanding perfectly. My father started bringing them water himself, remembers Sarah Peterson, whose family farm employed 6 POWs throughout 1944. Then he brought lemonade. Then my mother sent sandwiches. By harvest time, they were eating lunch at our kitchen table. Not everyone approved. Some neighbors stopped speaking to the Petersons. Letters appeared in local newspapers condemning fraternization with the enemy. The army reminded farmers that prisoners were not guests, not friends. They were defeated enemy combatants. But in the fields, under the impartial sun, such distinctions blurred. A prisoner named Otto helped deliver a calf when it came breech. Werner fixed the Johnsons' tractor when it broke down mid-harvest. Giuseppe taught the Anderson children Italian counting rhymes while they picked beans together. The guards noticed but mostly looked the other way. This was America, after all, not a totalitarian state. If an old woman wanted to give a homesick prisoner her son's old coat, who were they to stop her? Letters began arriving from Germany and Italy, forwarded through military censors. Desperate pleas. Send food if you can. We are starving. The children cry at night. Some prisoners wept reading them. Some farmers witnessed those tears. The enemy was becoming human. By the summer of 1944, something remarkable had taken root in the small towns of Minnesota. The lines between captor and captive, between enemy and neighbor, had begun to blur in ways no one had anticipated. Young American men, exempt from service due to age or medical conditions, found themselves working alongside German prisoners. They were the same age, spoke different languages, had been taught to hate each other. Yet in the fields, they laughed together. We'd take breaks under the shade trees, recalled James Mitchell, who worked his family farm at 17. This one German kid, maybe 19, would try to teach me German words. I'd teach him English. We'd laugh at each other's terrible pronunciation. I never asked if he'd killed any Americans. He never asked if my brothers had killed any Germans. It didn't seem to matter there in that moment. The real controversy came with the women. In towns where most young men had gone to war, the presence of hundreds of young male prisoners created an inevitable dynamic. They were foreign, some were handsome, many were polite and cultured. The danger made them intriguing. Sunday afternoons, when prisoners had leisure time, locals would sometimes gather near the camp fences. Conversations happened. Glances were exchanged. Notes were passed. The case of Irma Carlson and Karl Teschner became local legend. Irma, 22, worked at the canning factory where Karl's labor detail was assigned. He spoke decent English, had been a university student before conscription. They talked during lunch breaks. He drew sketches of her. She brought him books. I knew it was wrong, Irma confessed decades later. He was the enemy, but he quoted Goethe, talked about philosophy and music. The boys I'd known talked about baseball and fixing cars. Karl made me feel like my thoughts mattered. When their relationship was discovered, both faced consequences. Karl was transferred to a different camp. Irma endured months of social ostracism, neighbors who wouldn't speak to her, former friends who called her a traitor. Yet she kept his letters, hidden in a shoebox, for the rest of her life. Such relationships were rare, but not unique. Military authorities issued stern warnings. Local newspapers printed editorials condemning unseemly fraternization. Guards were reminded to maintain proper distance, but the heart, as always, proved difficult to regulate. More common and more accepted were the family connections. The Johnsons invited their POW work crew to Sunday dinner. The elderly Mrs. Lindstrom taught Giuseppe English while he helped her with heavy chores her late husband used to do. The Andersons' prisoner, a man named Friedrich, played chess with their grandfather every evening. He was like another son, Martha Anderson said simply. He showed me photos of his mother in Berlin. I showed him photos of my boys in France. We both prayed they'd all come home safe. The camps themselves fostered unexpected culture. The YMCA, led by figures like Howard Hong, established educational programs. Prisoners could take correspondence courses, learn English, study American history. Libraries were stocked with books in German and Italian. Art flourished. Prisoners carved intricate wooden sculptures, painted landscapes of their adopted Minnesota home, composed music. The camp at Algona became famous for its elaborate nativity scene, three-dimensional figures crafted entirely from concrete by Italian prisoners. Locals came to admire it, bringing their children. Theater productions were staged. German classics performed in a prison camp in Iowa, attended by both prisoners and curious townspeople. Music concerts featured Italian tenors, whose voices made elderly women weep, remembering the old country their grandparents had left generations before. "We were creating a small civilization," wrote Lieutenant Harold Weber, camp administrator. These men, removed from the propaganda and violence of war, were remembering who they'd been before. Students, artists, farmers, sons. Some prisoners attended local churches, sitting in back pews, heads bowed in silent prayer. Ministers wrestled with conscience. Should the enemy be welcomed in God's house? Most concluded, especially the enemy. Yet for all the humanity blooming in those camps, darker forces still lurked. Not everyone had abandoned the ideology that started the war. Not everyone was ready for reconciliation. The storm clouds were gathering, even under Minnesota's peaceful skies. Not all prisoners came seeking peace. Some arrived with hatred still burning in their hearts. Inside the camps, a silent war continued. Die-hard Nazi loyalists, officers, SS members, fervent believers in Hitler's ideology, watched the others with contempt. They saw men who smiled at Americans, who accepted kindness from the enemy, who had forgotten their duty to the fatherland. They called them traitors. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a German prisoner was found hanged in the shower room. The official report called it suicide. Other prisoners whispered a different truth. He'd been too friendly with the guards, had spoken against Hitler. He'd been executed. Similar incidents occurred across the camp system, beatings in the night. Accidents during work details. A culture of fear maintained by fanatics who believed the war wasn't over, that surrender was betrayal, that any German who cooperated with Americans deserved death. Camp administrators struggled to identify the extremists. The U.S. Army began segregating prisoners based on ideology. Those who demonstrated anti-Nazi sentiment, who expressed willingness to embrace democratic values, were separated from the hardliners. Howard Lake Camp in Minnesota became a sanctuary. Prisoners who'd been threatened, who'd renounced Nazism, who simply wanted to survive and go home. They were transferred there, away from the fanatics who would harm them. "We had prisoners who were more afraid of their fellow Germans than of us," recalled Captain Ernest Townsend. Young men whose crime was wanting the war to end, who dared to say Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. Their own countrymen wanted them dead for it. Meanwhile, outside the camps, American sentiment was shifting. By 1945, as Allied forces liberated concentration camps, the full horror of the Holocaust became undeniable. Newsreels showed skeletal survivors, mass graves, gas chambers. The American public, which had developed sympathy for their German prisoners, now confronted an unbearable truth. These men, the ones eating at their tables, working their fields, playing with their children, had come from that system. Not all were guilty, but all were complicit. How could you reconcile the polite young man who fixed your tractor with the images of Auschwitz and Dachau? Some farmers refused to let prisoners return to their fields. Communities that had welcomed them now demanded their immediate deportation. Letters to newspapers called for harsh treatment, for justice, for punishment. The prisoners themselves struggled with the revelations. Many genuinely hadn't known. Some refused to believe it, dismissed it as Allied propaganda. Others were devastated, ashamed of what their nation had become. "I read the newspaper accounts," wrote Heinrich Müller in his diary. "I saw the photographs. I wept. I thought I was fighting for Germany, for my family. Instead, I served monsters." Yet even amid the darkness, Small absurdities persisted. Prisoners still occasionally escaped, not to flee to Germany, but to visit nearby towns. They were found at county fairs, eating hot dogs, in local bars, drinking beer, at movie theaters, watching Hollywood films. They were always returned to camp with minimal punishment. Where, after all, could they run? Germany was an ocean away. The war was ending. But what would happen next? May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years finally ended. In Minnesota's POW camps, the news arrived with mixed emotions. For the prisoners, it meant going home. But home to what? The repatriation began slowly. Ships that had brought them to America now carried them back across the Atlantic. At train stations throughout Minnesota, scenes unfolded that no one had anticipated. Farmers shook hands with the men who'd worked their fields. Women packed boxes of food, canned goods, dried meats, flour, pressing them into prisoners' hands. "For your families," they said, "for the children." Some prisoners wept openly. After years of being treated with unexpected dignity, fed when their own people starved, given humanity when they'd expected cruelty, leaving felt like abandoning family. "Mr. Olson gave me his address," recalled Werner Schmidt decades later. He said, "Write to me. Let me know you're safe." I couldn't speak. I just nodded and shook his hand. That handshake meant more to me than any medal I'd received in the Wehrmacht. The letters began arriving within months, hundreds of them, forwarded through military channels and later through private mail. Former prisoners writing to the American families who'd employed them, thanking them, updating them, pleading with them. Carl Fischer wrote to the Johnsons, "I have returned to Hamburg. There is no Hamburg anymore. Rubble and ghosts. My family survived, but we have nothing. The bread you sent saved my mother's life. I will never forget your kindness when you had every reason to hate me." Giuseppe Marconi wrote to Mrs. Lindstrom, "Minnesota taught me what America truly means. Not the propaganda we were fed, but the reality I lived. You treated me like a human being when I was your enemy. This is something I will tell my children and grandchildren." The contrast between Minnesota's fertile fields and Germany's devastated cities was almost incomprehensible. Prisoners who'd gained weight in American camps returned to a nation where people fought over scraps, where cities lay in ruins, where millions were displaced, starving, traumatized. Some couldn't bear it. They wrote desperate letters. "Is there any way I can return? Can I immigrate to America? I have skills. I will work hard. Please, help me come back." American immigration law was strict, but not absolute. By the early 1950s, some former POWs successfully obtained visas. They returned not as prisoners, but as free men, as immigrants seeking the American dream. Alfred Mueller was among them. Captured in North Africa, he'd spent 3 years working farms in southern Minnesota under the administration of Camp Algona, located just across the border in Iowa. He returned to Germany in 1946, married his childhood sweetheart, and struggled through the harsh post-war years. In 1952, he immigrated legally to the United States, settled in Iowa, and became a citizen. In 1976, he donated his POW uniform and personal items to the Camp Algona POW Museum, the very place that had once overseen the fields where he worked. In 1976, he donated his POW uniform and personal items to the Camp Algona POW Museum. "This camp saved my life," he told the curator, "not just physically, but spiritually. I arrived as a Nazi. I left as a human being who understood that the enemy is not always who they tell you it is." The museums became repositories of memory. The nativity scene created by Italian POWs at Algona was preserved, restored, displayed. Photographs of smiling prisoners working alongside American farmers lined exhibition walls. Letters, artifacts, testimonies, all carefully archived. Descendants of both prisoners and farmers began connecting. A German woman contacted a Minnesota family. "My grandfather worked your farm during the war. He spoke of you with such gratitude. May I visit?" Invitations were extended, reunions arranged, old photographs shared. "My father never talked much about the war," said Robert Teschner, Carl's son, visiting Minnesota in 2003. But he kept a photo of a young woman named Irma in his desk drawer. When he was dying, he told me about her, about Minnesota, about how Americans taught him that enemies could become friends. He said those years as a prisoner were when he truly became free. Dr. Margaret Chen, historian, reflects, what happened in these camps was an experiment in radical empathy. America took its enemies and treated them with dignity, not because they deserved it, but because Americans chose to see their humanity. That choice changed thousands of lives. The fields still stand. The camps are gone, replaced by farmland and subdivisions, but the memory persists, whispered through generations. A memory of when enemies became neighbors and war gave birth to unexpected peace. The cornfields of Minnesota stretch endlessly, golden waves bending in the wind. The same fields where prisoners once worked, where enemies became neighbors, where hatred gave way to something fragile and profound. In small-town museums, photographs fade slowly behind glass. Young men in Wehrmacht uniforms stand beside American farmers, all of them squinting into the sun, all of them smiling. Letters in careful handwriting speak of gratitude, of transformation, of lives forever changed. The barracks are gone, the guard towers dismantled decades ago. Nature has reclaimed the land where thousands of prisoners once slept, dreamed of home, and discovered an unexpected truth about their captors. What remains is the lesson. In the midst of history's deadliest conflict, when hatred consumed nations and ideology demanded absolute loyalty, ordinary Americans made an extraordinary choice. They chose to see the human face behind the enemy uniform. They chose dignity over vengeance, compassion over cruelty. They didn't do it for glory. No medals were awarded for sharing Sunday dinner with a prisoner, no monuments erected for the farmer who taught a German boy to drive a tractor, or the woman who sent food packages to a starving family in Hamburg. They did it simply because it was right. The prisoners who returned to Germany carried more than memories. They carried proof that the propaganda had lied, that Americans weren't monsters, that even in war, humanity could survive. Some became voices for democracy in a rebuilding nation. Others simply raised children who never learned to hate. Nothing speaks louder about a people than how they treat their enemies. In those Minnesota fields, in those quiet acts of kindness between captor and captive, a seed was planted. A seed that whispered, even your enemy is human. Even in darkness, choose light. The harvest of that choice echoes still, in the children and grandchildren who remember, who preserve the story, who understand its meaning. War creates enemies. Only humanity creates peace.